Is pen and ink the best medium for working in a sketchbook? I think so. But I mean, what do I know? Greetings, my name is Zach, and welcome to the session for today. When I run into situations where I'm not sure quite what to do, when I'm lacking inspiration, I often go back to the things I love. What I decided to sit down and do for this drawing session was Ridley from Super Metroid. In fact, he may have occurred in the first Metroid game, but the iteration that I'm so familiar with is from Super Metroid, because that's the first Metroid game that I played. Now, Metroid has a significant place in my life in general, but so do many other video games, and many other things from my past. If I was really to sit down and think about the stuff that got my visual memory started, and my love for drawing and articulating forms, it probably is things like early video games, Star Wars, my first reading of The Hobbit when I was in 4th grade, Power Rangers, and a lot of those kinds of things. I spent a lot of time as a kid in my imagination, in my head, playing games with my friends, and a lot of the games that we played were based on the video games, the stories, and the movies that we watched and that we put a lot of time into. Those things now exist in the back of my mind as visual reminders and benchmarks. I can go back to them, I can find them, I can pull them out and use them when I'm not sure quite what to do. And sometimes it's like this, where I went and found a reference and I'm working from that reference and I'm just kind of lazily putting it together. It's really stress relieving. And it's kind of exciting too, because anytime that a drawing like this turns out well, I have this like homage that I've paid to something that was so significant in my life when I was a little kid. And these moments, these little intersections of joy and time from a time that's very long past, is grounding. It puts me in a place where I have a better understanding and appreciation for where I am now. Now I get to sit down and play video games, but it's very different. I'm an adult. I've got a house to manage. I've got a kid. I'm married. There's a lot of other things that have to be handled in my life. But it's not me waiting for my Saturday morning cartoons or the half an hour of video game time that I got in the evening when I was a kid. Now I've got to deal with all of my other tasks and my chores. And frequently my video game time is relegated to after my daughter has gone to bed at night, after I've spent time with my wife, after all the other necessary components are taken care of. But it's kind of funny and it's interesting in a way, because now that time exists as a reward. I am in the same way that I was when I was really little. I'm rewarded at the end of my day with video games. Now it's all self-inflicted. Like my wife wouldn't be upset with me if I was playing more video games, for example, but I would be. I would be upset with myself if I wasn't accomplishing things, if I wasn't finishing things and getting things done. I would feel this sense of a lack of purpose. And so I've got my job and all my things that I have to see through to the end. And then at the end of the day, after everyone's gone to sleep, I get to play video games. And I get to go back to being, 8 years old or younger and waking up early or staying up late and maybe even, trying to sneak down and play Command and Conquer while my parents were asleep or whatever it might be. Video games are this oddly grounding thing, and I pull a lot of inspiration for them. And I pull the inspiration for them specifically because they're things that I love. Stories and characters and monsters and all of these design elements are things that are interesting to me because I love them. Because they tell us something about our humanity. They tell us something about a world that exists and also things about a world that doesn't exist. And so they're fun to delve into. They're fun to spend time with. And when I take time away from those things, when I go back in and I listen to some new lore content on The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, when I relearn things about Star Wars, they touch on these pieces of nostalgia. And I'm back to being a little kid again. I'm back to being this little version of me that enjoys these things so much. And this is something that I think is really beneficial for us as artists. If you have a moment where you're not sure quite what to work on, go back to the things that you love. Go back to the things that inspired you initially. It's easy to get really far from them. If you're a writer, you don't have to write the material that is very similar to what your favorite authors wrote, but you can be inspired by how they wrote. You can be inspired by how you felt about the things that they wrote. And it's very easy to do that. It's easy to go back in. If you were a huge Harry Potter fan growing up, and maybe you've got some issues with how J.K. Rowling has been handling things in the last little while, or maybe you've realized that the stories are really stories for kids and they were great for you when you were young, but now that you're older, you want something that's a little different. Well, there's your impetus right there. There's your marching orders, is build that for the next generation. And in that same train of thought, you don't have to write another Lord of the Rings. You don't have to be another Da Vinci. You can be inspired by those people, by those wonderful, amazing people and the things that they produced. And you can go in that same train of thought, in that same vein. But go back to the things that you love. I think that's one of the best ways that you can handle inspiration, that you can really go back to its roots, where its roots were for you, in love. Inspiration is an interesting thing in and of itself, but I find that it gets tied up and wrapped up with motivation. That motivation and inspiration, I'm not sure if they're intrinsically linked, but they seem to have a lot of interactions, or maybe they fulfill similar roles for us as artists. Inspiration, coming from the root of inspire, something that gives us the impetus to do a thing. It's almost the excitement that leads us into something, whereas motivation it comes from the root to motivate. Our motive, what is the objective? So motivations are much more driven off of what our objective is, whereas an inspiration is driven off of our excitement, something that inspires us to do something or to be something different than what we are. So they seem like they can fulfill similar roles. You can sit down and work on your art, whatever form that might take, because of one of these. You can be so inspired that you sit down to paint something. You can be motivated to get a grade in a class. You can be motivated to achieve and to progress and to grow, and so you make your piece of art. I wonder then if the two working in tandem might actually be the most effective way to progress, to grow, and to succeed as an artist. If you have the inspiration to do something, to go forward, then that's excitement. It propels you forward. And then the motive behind your projects or your progress can be a little bit more nuanced. The motive might be to make a career out of this, or maybe in a smaller sense to simply finish this project and have it be something that you're proud of, something that you're excited to show your partner or your family or your parents. So it seems like inspiration and motivation are certainly not the same thing. They point us in the same direction, perhaps, when it comes to our artistic progress, but they fulfill distinct roles. And I was mentioning earlier that, a lot of inspiration comes from the things that you love. I don't think motivation does. It can, I suppose. If you were in a situation, when I was working landscaping, I had a lot of coworkers where their motive for working each day and working very hard was they had little kids at home who needed to eat. And ironically, at that point in life, I looked at that and I was envious of that. Not envious of the fact that they had kids that I didn't have a kid yet, but envious of the fact that they had motive and they had purpose in their work. I had just finished college and hadn't landed my teaching career yet and was just working because I needed to make some money. And it wasn't making quite enough that it was really fulfilling much more beyond that. And so I had these coworkers who were just so excited to come do the crappy, landscaping work that we were doing every day. And they were motivated to do that by a desire to take care of their kids and their family. And I was envious of that purpose. The fact that they had this distinct motive where if I didn't work there, I could go get a job somewhere else, or, we could probably just scrape by, until I found myself in a new job or a new career. I didn't have a distinct motive other than occupying my time and making some money so that the entire financial burden of the house wasn't on my wife. So motive and inspiration are then linked, but not the same. And it's easy for us to play with these terms in our mind and to use them interchangeably, but I do think that they probably will work better if we find a way to work with them in tandem, to find motives that are long-lasting and pull us out of our day-to-day, and allow the inspiration to be something that kicks us into motion. maybe motive is what gets you up in the morning. You're probably not inspired at 6 o'clock in the morning to get up and work on your artwork or to get up and go to work. But motivation can be what gets you up in the morning. It's perhaps why you set your alarm clock, right? You have a motive to get up at a particular time. So motivation is this thing that is intrinsically built by you for a purpose. It's a motive that you construct for a purpose. But if you allow yourself to have beneficial motives that move you in directions that you want to go, then you can allow yourself to be inspired. So if I have the motive to get up early and work on my art before I take care of everything else I need to in a day, now that I'm up and that I'm working, that I'm having my cup of coffee, I can now be inspired by things. I've constructed the environment to allow myself to be inspired. Maybe that's the way to progress with this. Maybe that's how we ought to operate with this, is that we ought to think about how do we use motivation and inspiration in conjunction with one another. I don't like horror. I've never enjoyed horror movies or anything, but it's come to my attention lately with Metroid games, which I mentioned at the beginning of this session, and this is what I'm drawing in the background. It came to my attention that they're kind of regarded as a horror game, and I immediately rejected that because that's how I operate in life. Where it's like, this is not the assumption I had, so fie on you. And then the more I delved into it and thought about it, I went, oh my goodness, I think it's kind of right. There are these games that take place in real dark environments where you almost always have no interaction with anybody. In Super Metroid, for example, you have the cutscene at the beginning, and that's like the only dialogue in the game. And then basically you leave a space station with this little baby Metroid, and like a couple minutes later, you get a distress call. You go back, everyone's dead. You go into the last room. There's the little Metroid in the little glass container, and then the guy that I'm drawing right now, Ridley, his eyes just glow out of the darkness. And then he attacks you, and you can't win the fight. There's no way to. And he goes down to the planet Zebus down below, and you follow him. And so you've got this very horror-esque way of starting the story. And I don't know if maybe I was just too young, or if maybe it did scare me the first time and I didn't think about it, but the games are stressful because there's no social interactions, there's no speaking, there's no dialogue. You play as a single character in this dark world where basically everything hates you. And in most of the games, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 helpers of some kind throughout the game, but the vast majority of the alien life that you encounter is hostile. And so it is this weird horror-esque environment, and I'm not a big fan of those things. At least I thought I wasn't. Maybe not. Maybe I'm not a fan of them when it comes to movies and to books. But when it comes to video games, Elden Ring had a lot of those components too, where it's dark, and there are certain parts of Stormvale Castle where you're in there and the grafted scion is like walking around in one of the like dining halls, and it is terrifying. And I think maybe on my first like 3 playthroughs, I'm just like, no, screw that. Like I'm sneaking by. I'm not attacking this guy because they're scary. Not as scary as the Revenants, which are like the most universally hated foe in that game. But I've come to the realization that some of my favorite games have horror themes. And I think part of what it is in the Metroid series, you feel powerful and you feel successful when you're able to survive this ridiculously hostile environment. You are a single person accomplishing a task that is mammoth in scale and is undoable by anyone else, and you go into this realm and you come out of it the victor, or you die. And in Elden Ring, it's kind of the same thing. You're this tarnished, you're this person who is not a part of the system. You're rejected by most of the people, and you come in and you're up against enormous odds, and you go through the game and you win, and you become Elden Lord. And there's something about this fear and this horror that is essentially human. And I think that sometimes movies and video games can bring in this primal fear that we as creatures have, but we don't experience often in first world countries today. If you live in a place where you do experience that, my condolences. That sounds terrifying. But most of us don't encounter things that are going to potentially kill us on a frequent basis. But these video games give us the ability to experience that, and experience that in a way that our ancestors, whether you think of it historically, anthropologically, or evolutionarily, we encountered things for the vast majority of our existence where we were not secure. We were not 100% sure that we were coming out the other side of this migration, this war, this colonization unscathed. And I think that sometimes the dark aspects of these movies and video games and stories can bring us into that primal component of who we are as human beings and help us to re-engage with that. Now, I gotta think about that for a second. Like, is that good? Is that healthy? I think it's certainly an exploration of what we are and who we are and where we came from. And I think that that's usually beneficial. I think it's a really bad thing for us to get to the point where we are so haughty and arrogant to think that we have somehow evolved or grown beyond these things. We're still creatures at the end of the day. We're still human, and we've got baser level instincts that are underneath all of our drama in our Facebook and our Instagram, but they still exist, and they still drive a lot of what we do. Psychologists are continuing to discover more about how the human brain works and all the chemicals and all the responses to things. And we're learning that a lot of how we operate and why we operate the way we do is based on these primal components of what we are and who we are as beings. And I don't know. I think that is reassuring in some ways. I think that it's good to be reminded of the fact that we are small, that we are little things in the grand cosmos, and that's okay. That's okay for us to remember that we're small. I think we have a tendency to get pretty arrogant. Thinking about whether alien life exists out there or not, I think that there's a lot of philosophical things to talk about with that. But one of the really interesting things from my perspective is it would be good for us to be humbled. If we found that there is indeed life out there, or that we are behind the power curve when it comes to all that. Like, it would not be a bad thing for humanity to go, oh crap, like, we're not the only ones. We're not the first ones. We're not so special. And I mean, I think that we are quite special. We are very unique and very interesting, and our lives are very special. But there's this weird middle ground, this Aristotelian mean that I think we are benefited from seeking in how we think of ourselves in the universe. Like, we are sophisticated, we are important, we are valid, and we are special. But we're not so special that we're more special than everything else. And if we start thinking down that train of thought, like, we start missing out on a lot of really unique and beautiful components of what it is to exist and what it is to be human. And we can get into this weird realm where we don't care about the damage that we have on people or the environment around us because we think that it revolves around us. And I just don't think that's great for the psyche, even if it was true and this entire universe is just our playground from some deity who's thrown us in and you have full reign to do whatever you want, which I suppose there are some religions that profess that, but that wouldn't be good for us as humans to know, even if it was true, because it would just play into our arrogance as human beings. And that arrogance is dangerous. And I don't think that arrogance is helpful when it comes to us moving our way through existence and through life. It just hit me. I was like, I started talking about how Metroid's a horror game, and now I'm over here about the existential nature of our place in the universe and arrogance and humility. Have you ever wanted a snapshot of what my art classes were like once we were on a project and we were working through things? That's pretty much it. We would just kind of end up in these weird metaphysical conundrums and contemplation, and then that it would resume. The next day we'd come back, we'd pick things up again, we'd start moving forward, and inevitably some student would come in and would be like, hey, I looked into this last night, I read some more Aristotle, I looked into some Jung, and we would get these interesting conversations that would play out as we as a group tried to wrestle with what it is to be human and what makes us unique and what makes us interesting, and to pull apart those aspects and those pieces. The reality is it's complicated, and I think that we're always better off doing that with friends and with family and with people that are important to us and precious to us. I think it's easier to work through who you are as a human being when you've got a crowd of people around you that you matter to. And I think that was the beautiful part about that classroom environment, about all the relationships that were built there, is it's a group of people who are working towards a common goal, a common purpose, and they care about each other. And in that environment, you can work through difficult philosophical issues. You can work through personal traumas. I'm obviously not going to bring up some of those here because that wouldn't be quite fair to the students who disclose those things. And I could probably try to get approval from some of them, but it still doesn't feel quite right. It's the same reason I don't mention my students by name. Maybe at some point I will. Maybe at some point I'll bring them on for some the podcasty material, which I would love to. I would love to do that. But at this point, it just doesn't feel fair. Like there's a certain anonymity and there's a certain trust that was displayed in those conversations and in the things that we talked about. And it's better, I think, fundamentally better to work through those kinds of things with a group of people that you matter to and that matter to you. And community. This is another pitch for community. If you don't have it, try to find it. And if you don't have it, I'm sorry. And I really hope that you'll be able to find a group and a crowd that you fit in with and that you blend in with. I think that's one of the really cool things about art in general, in high school, in college, and any of those places, is just the community aspects that you get out of that. I was starting to put together some notes for podcast here in the next couple weeks that'll be on like why you should go to art school, and then follow that up with why you shouldn't go to art school. And one of the big aspects of why you should is community. And oh my goodness, I was hit with the nostalgia just going back over in my head, like, oh yeah, this person and that guy and this person over here. And I just have all these fond memories of all these people that I spent time with at university. And then immediately followed by the lamentation that I have not kept in contact. Like when I went out of school, I started working full time. And then about a year after that, I went into the teaching workforce and started a school. And I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's that I was just didn't prioritize it time-wise, or if I was putting too much time into other things. If I don't know what it was in me, but I didn't hold on to those relationships. And I have surprisingly few relationships from my college and high school days. And I lament that. I'm bummed that I don't have that anymore. And so if you're hearing this and you're in that age group, I would recommend that at least for a year or two after you finish with those institutions, try to hold on to those relationships. If you determine at a certain point that they're not healthy or necessary anymore, great, but you'll have had that as a decision, and you won't be in a position where you look back later and go, man, crap, I wish I wouldn't have done that. And you could make that decision and look back later and be like, that was the wrong decision. But I look back on it now and go, I didn't really make a decision. I made a decision out of indecision. And that's the worst reason to make a decision. So I would just encourage you that if you're in that space, that you hold on to those relationships for at least a while, because you just don't know who you're going to be. And you don't know if it's going to be something that's going to be beneficial for you in the near-ish future. And on that note, I'm going to close out this session. So if you're still with me, thanks for holding on. I appreciate it. I am hoping that these sessions give you some things to listen to in the background while you're working. And I'm hope that they help you with some of your just thought processes and function as a human being. In some little small way, I hope to create a little bit of the environment that my students had and benefited from when I was in the classroom on a daily basis, and to create that for other people. The goal is just to hopefully provide some comfort and some space for those kinds of things. So anyway, I hope that is helping you out in some regard. So have a good one, y'all. See you soon.